Night owl. That was what they called her. The night shift nurse who moved through Seattle General like she was trying not to take up space, who flinched at the attending physician's raised voices during morning report, who never held eye contact long enough to be memorable. They didn't know that the woman pushing me for cart at 0247 had hands trained to keep people alive in places where the screaming never stopped. They didn't know that the slight limp she favored in her left leg came from an IED in Ramadi that should have killed her but didn't. She had been dead for 11 seconds before her own hands brought herself back. What happened next changed everything. Sarah Chen moved through the fourth-floor corridors of Seattle General in Norfolk with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent 12 years learning to disappear in plain sight. Her orthopedic shoes made no sound against the polished linoleum that reflected fluorescent lights like a surgical field. The antiseptic smell mixed with burned coffee from the nurse's station 3 rooms back, the scent of a hospital locked in the exhausted rhythm of night shift. Her badge clipped to her scrubs red vest Chen, RN, nothing more. Just a nurse. Nobody needed to know about the tremor in her right hand that came from holding too many bleeding wounds. She hid it by gripping clipboards tighter, by keeping her movements controlled, deliberate, the kind of composure that came from having already survived the worst the world could offer. 0247 hours. The shift was 6 hours old and 4 hours from ending. Sarah had already started 14 full lines, 2 of them on patients with veins that made even experienced nurses reach for ultrasound guidance. She didn't need ultrasound. Her hands found the radial artery on a 73-year-old diabetic in the same way a sniper finds a target, with absolute certainty and no wasted motion. The intern shadowing her had blinked, said nothing, and made a note in his pocket notebook. Sarah pretended not to notice. The last thing she needed was attention. She pushed the medication cart toward the ICU, the metal wheel squeaking with a sound like distant static. The isolation rooms glowed behind glass walls, each one a small universe of monitors and tubing and the soft mechanical breathing of ventilators. Her eyes found the chart slot for room for 12 before she meant them to. General Raymond Hartley. USMC, retired. 68 years old. Admitted 2,100 hours. Respiratory distress, suspected atypical pneumonia. Sarah stopped walking. Her hand moved to the chart with an automaticity that scared her. The same hand that had held steady when mortar rounds fell around her medical tent in Jolene District, the same hand that had pushed epinephrine into a Marine's chest cavity during a convoy ambush. That hand was supposed to be anonymous. That hand was supposed to belong to a nurse nobody looked at twice. She pulled Hartley's medication orders and read them standing in the hallway, her eyes tracking across the lines with the focus of someone reading a cipher. Cholinesterase inhibitors. 2 separate orders for atropine, flagged as standing orders rather than PRN. A blood panel that showed acetylcholinesterase levels that didn't match pneumonia, that matched something else entirely, something she had only seen in classified briefing documents stamped FOUO and buried in the restricted section of her discharge papers. Organophosphate exposure. Not accidental exposure. The medication pattern was specific. Deliberate. Someone was treating Hartley for nerve agent poisoning while the diagnosis read atypical pneumonia. Sarah's breath caught, a small sound, and she forced it out through her nose in the measured cadence that had kept her alive in emergency rooms that used to be mosques. She knew Hartley. Not personally. But she knew his face because David had mentioned it in letters during his first deployment. David's commanding officer. The man who had written the letters that came home with the division chaplain's signature, letters that said her son's unit had taken fire near Camp Anbar but that everyone had made it back. Those letters had kept David alive through 2 rotations because they meant someone above him was paying attention, taking casualties personally. Raymond Hartley had been that someone. And now someone was poisoning him while disguising it as infection. Lingering over a chart, Chen. She didn't flinch. The voice came from her left, 6 feet away, and she had already calculated 3 exit routes before he finished speaking. Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood in the doorway of the physician's lounge with a ceramic mug in his hand that probably cost more than her weekly grocery budget. His scrubs were perfectly fitted, his hair perfectly groomed, The kind of expensive casual that came from old money and the assumption that the world would make space for him without asking. He had been the chief of medicine at Seattle General for 5 years. Before that, something with the Pentagon. His tenure here had coincided with budget cuts that somehow never affected his office or his salary. Sarah turned slowly, her expression settling into the soft blankness she had perfected over 12 years and 2 careers. Reviewing orders, Dr. Caldwell. Reviewing or memorizing? His eyes moved from her face to the chart in her hands. His smile had the quality of a weapon being checked for functionality. General Hartley is my patient. His care doesn't require that level of attention from the night shift. She closed the chart with deliberate slowness, her movement controlled. His orders came through incomplete. I was clarifying before the morning physician rounds. How thorough? Caldwell's fingers tapped against his mug. The sound was like a metronome, or a countdown. We have a full roster tonight. Your attention might be better spent elsewhere. Room for 08 has been waiting for a blood draw for 40 minutes. It was not a request. It was a direction wrapped in the language of courtesy. Sarah met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to acknowledge his authority without challenging it, and turned toward room for 08. She heard him moving back into the lounge as she walked, heard him make a phone call that began with "We may have a problem," and something in her chest tightened like a fist. But she kept walking. The blood draw in 408 was real. An 84-year-old woman with COPD whose oxygen saturation had been drifting down for hours. Sarah found her vein on the second try, drew 3 vials with tubes that clicked softly into the collection rack, and told the woman her labs would be back within the hour. She did not mention what she had seen in Hartley's chart. She did not mention that someone at Seattle General was treating a retired Marine general for chemical weapons exposure while the paperwork said pneumonia. The night pressed down around her, that particular wait of 0300 hours when the world narrowed to the space between beds and the only sound was the collective breathing of people broken by age and disease and the random terrible luck of biology. Sarah had known this hour in different rooms, in field hospitals where the casualties came faster than the body bags, where chemical weapons were not theoretical and the smell of nerve gas burning through skin was something you could never unknow. Ramadi had been 13 years ago. The memories did not fade. They only learned to be quiet. She moved through the hospital with the muscle memory of someone trained for something else, checking corners and exit routes with the situational awareness that had kept her alive when the world was trying to kill her. The faded unit patch was in her locker, sewn carefully inside the lining of the jacket she had worn on her last day at Walter Reed. She had stitched it there with surgical precision, the patch from 1st Marine Division, Weapons Company, the unit that had deployed her to the place that had taught her to hide who she was. Just a nurse. Nobody at Seattle General knew that she had spent 5 years as a combat medic before the medical discharge, before the classified TBI evaluation that had left her with the tremor and the insomnia and the ability to read poison in a medication pattern like it was written in English. Nobody knew that she had chosen night shift precisely because it meant fewer meetings, fewer physicians who might look at her too closely, fewer chances that someone would see the scar tissue she wore under her scrubs and ask questions that would require answers she could not give. But Caldwell was looking now. And he had seen something in the way her hand moved across Hartley's chart. The wrong kind of attention. The kind that got people moved to different floors, reassigned to shifts they didn't want, encouraged to take positions at other hospitals where they would be far enough away that no one would listen if they started asking uncomfortable questions about medication orders and diagnoses that did not align. Sarah finished her medication rounds with the same quiet precision she brought to everything, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid efficiency of something that had been trained for war. At 06:07 she would clock out. She would drive home to the small apartment in the suburbs where her son called once a month and asked how work was going. She would not tell him that a man she had heard him praise in letters was lying in an ICU bed being poisoned by someone with access to his medications. She would decide what to do when she was alone, when there were no eyes, when the only sound was the rain that was starting to hammer against her apartment windows like applause or ammunition, and she could think about what it meant that the pattern of poison in Hartley's blood work was not random, that it required knowledge, that it required someone inside the hospital who understood exactly what they were doing. What happened next would cost her everything. But that was not yet. First there was the rest of the shift. First there was the appearance of normalcy. First there was the dangerous clarity that came from understanding, in the stillness of 0300, that someone was trying to commit murder and that nobody was seeing it but her. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant frequency above her head, and Sarah Chen moved through the corridors of Seattle General with the invisible efficiency of a woman who had learned that the quietest warriors were the ones nobody ever saw coming. The overhead page crackled at 0630, and Sarah heard her name distorted through 15 years of speaker wire and institutional apathy. Nurse Night Owl to administration. Nurse Night Owl to administration. The nickname hung in the air like cigarette smoke, Caldwell's invention, weaponized 3 weeks ago during a morning briefing where he'd used it twice, each time with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Laughter rippled through the day shift corridor as they streamed past the nursing station. Someone snorted. A younger nurse, maybe 2 years out of school, covered her mouth. Sarah kept walking, her badge clipped to the same scrub she'd worn for 14 hours, her movements economical and purposeful in a way that made her invisible. That was the gift Ramadi had given her, the ability to walk through rooms as if she existed in a slightly different dimension than everyone else. The administration office on the 4th floor was aggressively beige, the kind of space designed to make anyone sitting in it feel smaller. Sarah waited 17 minutes in a chair that faced a closed door. A desk sat empty. No one had called the meeting. No one answered when she buzzed. She understood then, the page had been the point. Not summoning her, but humiliating her. The nickname broadcast to 300 staff members, her compliance assumed, her presence in administration unnecessary. She turned and walked back downstairs, her jaw tight enough to crack teeth, and found Dr. Marcus Caldwell waiting in the 3rd-floor supply closet when she arrived to restock the insulin vials. He blocked the door. 53 years old, Italian shoes that cost more than her monthly car payment, hair that had never known a bad day. His voice came out like he was discussing a weather pattern, clinical, inevitable, already decided. Sarah, I've been reviewing the staffing efficiency reports. Your hesitancy with complex cases, the way you second-guess physician orders, it suggests you're overwhelmed by the acuity level here. The fluorescent panel above them hummed, casting him in that institutional pallor that made everyone look slightly cadaverous. Budget cuts mean we need to reallocate underperforming staff. The county clinic would actually be more appropriate for your skill set. Unless you can demonstrate you're ready for this kind of responsibility. She stood in front of a shelf of insulin pens, her fingers gripping the edge of the supply cart. One measured breath. Then another. The acetone smell of the disinfectant wipes mixed with the plastic chemical tang of the sharps containers, and her hands didn't shake because her hands never shook anymore. That had been burned out of her in Fallujah, in the kind of heat that made you understand what it meant to be carved from stone. My competence, she said, her voice level as a surgeon's incision, has never required your validation, Dr. Caldwell. One tear escaped, the kind of tear that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with rage she couldn't afford to show. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, and for 1 second, just one, she saw something flicker across his face. Uncertainty. Fear, maybe. The look a man gets when he realizes he's picked a fight with someone operating from a completely different rulebook. Then his jaw tightened and he stepped aside. She took the cart and left, moving down the hallway with the kind of calm that came from having already survived the worst, the kind that made people instinctively give her space without understanding why. That afternoon, shift change hit at 1500, and the parking lot filled with the transition, day shift heading out, night shift trickling in, the overlap chaos of a hospital trying to hand off 200 patients to 200 new sets of hands. Sarah was heading to her car when Caldwell appeared in the lot, his presence like a weather system moving in, and he staged it perfectly. 50 staff members within earshot. His voice carrying across the asphalt with the precision of someone who'd calculated acoustics. Night Owl, your son David, he served under General Hartley, didn't he? He said it as a statement, not a question. It must be difficult, being emotionally compromised by that kind of connection. Patient care requires objectivity. It would be unfortunate if your personal complications with that particular patient affected your clinical judgment. Perhaps you're not quite ready for this level of responsibility. Perhaps you never were. She stood in the center of the parking lot, not moving, not flinching, not giving him the satisfaction of seeing her break. Just breathing. One breath. Another. The September sun was starting to angle lower, and the asphalt smelled like hot concrete and diesel exhaust from the loading dock. Whispers followed her as she walked to her car, the kind of whispers that poison slowly, seeping into the spaces between people's decisions about whether they trust you, whether they believe you, whether they think you're stable. She drove in silence, hands at 10 and 2, the hospital receding in her mirror like something she was watching happen to someone else. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came in the next 24 hours, when the strategic dismantling accelerated into something approaching art form. Caldwell reassigned the 3 veteran nurses who'd worked the ward alongside Sarah, Rodriguez with 19 years of experience, Chen with 15, Martinez with 12. All transferred to different floors by 0800 the next morning. Not demoted. Not fired. Just separated, scattered like pieces of a puzzle that had started to form a picture he didn't like. Her rotation got altered that same day. Double shift starting at 1900, pushing through until 0730, 8-hour gaps that barely accommodated sleep. She was too exhausted to ask questions, too isolated to find corroboration. The charge nurse, Sarah had known her for 8 years, stopped making eye contact. By 1100, Caldwell had called the hospital board members. Sarah heard him through his office door while running supplies, his voice smooth and reasonable, carrying the kind of authority that comes from being the chief of medicine. "We have a nurse with PTSD making erratic accusations about a decorated physician's judgment. For patient safety, I'm recommending immediate action." The words patient safety and erratic were positioned precisely where they needed to be. By lunch, her computer access had been downgraded. Her login permissions restricted. She couldn't access the full charts anymore, couldn't document discrepancies in the system, couldn't even pull up the detailed medication records she'd been analyzing. That night, sitting in her apartment with the lights off, Sarah opened her laptop and stared at the keyboard for 47 minutes. The old email address was still in her saved passwords, major.s.chen@dod.mil, a relic from another life that she'd sworn she'd never use again. She typed every detail about General Hartley's symptoms, the muscle fasciculations, the salivation, the pupil constriction, the cholinesterase inhibitors that didn't match a pneumonia diagnosis, the organophosphate markers that screamed nerve agent exposure, the pattern she'd recognized from classified reports in Ramadi before the medical discharge that had no official explanation. She attached photographs of his chart taken with her phone. She detailed the timeline of Caldwell's escalation, the page, the supply closet, the parking lot, the reassignments. She laid out what a competent observer would see if they looked at what was actually written in the medical record versus what the diagnosis claimed. Her fingers hovered over send at 0341. She thought about David, stationed at Camp Lejeune, about Hartley and whatever operation had landed him in that ICU room. About the 14 years she'd been invisible, quiet, moving through hospitals like a ghost who'd learned to ask for nothing and expect less. Then she pressed send. The email disappeared into a system she hadn't accessed in a decade. No confirmation. No response. Just the digital equivalent of a message in a bottle thrown into a very large, very dark ocean. She closed the laptop and sat in the dark wondering if she'd just ended her career or saved a life, and understanding with absolute clarity that by tomorrow morning, everything would change. The fire alarm screamed at 0247, their wail cutting through the quiet of Seattle General's night shift like a predator's cry. Sarah heard it from the supply closet where she was restocking for stations, that sound that made her nervous system recognize a threat before her conscious mind caught up. Smoke. Electrical fire, probably. The maintenance crew had flagged the second-floor wiring 3 weeks ago. She moved with the evacuation flow, watching orderlies wheel patients toward the stairwells, watching residents direct foot traffic with the frantic precision of people who'd never actually practiced this drill in reality, only in theory. The ICU was emptying when she caught the door. General Hartley's isolation room. The door was still closed. The monitors inside still beat their steady rhythm, visible through the glass. No one had evacuated him yet. Sarah's hand was already on the doorframe when she saw the orderly, a man she didn't recognize from night shift, moving fast down the corridor away from the ICU, toward the stairwell. His pace wasn't evacuation speed. His pace was purposeful. His hand was in the medication cart. She didn't hesitate. Not anymore. The ICU isolation room was thick with humidity from the ventilator, antiseptic layered over the metallic smell of blood and saline. General Hartley was seizing. His body arched against the bed rails, muscles locked in the tetanic contraction of someone whose nervous system had been hijacked by chemicals. The foreline was detached, hanging slack, dripping clear fluid onto the linoleum. His medication scattered across the bedside table, bottles upturned, caps missing. Not fire damage. Not accidental. The monitor screamed with bradycardia. His heart rate had plummeted to 38 beats per minute, a rhythm that meant shutdown, meant the final countdown. Organophosphate poisoning accelerated. Caldwell's sabotage moving toward completion. Sarah, evacuate now. Caldwell's voice came from the doorway, calm and surgical, the voice of a man managing a crisis with perfect professionalism. That's an order. I'll handle the general. She didn't turn. She was already moving toward the crash cart, her hand steady as a surgical laser as she pulled the emergency medications. Caldwell stepped into the room, his hand moving toward the four-pole, toward the medication administration set, toward the final dose that would stop what the poisoning hadn't finished. Step back, Dr. Caldwell. Her voice dropped an octave. Now. He froze. Something in her bearing had shifted, something that made his nervous system recognize a threat before his conscious mind could process it. She didn't wait for him to move. She just positioned herself between him and the generals for access, and Caldwell turned and left, his footsteps quick on the tile, disappearing into the corridor filled with smoke and sirens. The atropine was 10 milligrams, for push, the dose that would block the organophosphate's grip on her patient's acetylcholine receptors. Her hands moved with muscle memory from Ramadi, muscle memory that didn't need conscious thought because she'd done this 17 times before on Marines with names she still carried. Needle in. Flush line. Atropine first. 1, 2, 3 seconds. The convulsions began to ease immediately, the tetanic lock releasing as the medication hit his nervous system like an off switch. But his lungs were shutting down. The ventilator was compensating, but not fast enough. Respiratory failure was minutes away. Sarah had no access to his altered chart, no way to know what medications Caldwell had ordered, what contraindications existed in the corrupted record. She had only what she could see and what she remembered. She grabbed the 18-gauge for catheter from the crash cart and moved to his groin, hands working with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd triaged casualties under fire. The femoral artery was palpable, easy to find. One stick. She had it. She threaded the IO needle, the intraosseous catheter that would let her push medications directly into his bone marrow when his veins were in collapse. The crash cart bone drill hummed as she positioned it against his proximal tibia, the sound like a dentist's tool, precise and invasive. 30 seconds. The needle was in. She drew up the pralidoxime, 600 milligrams, the reactivator that would restore the organophosphate blocked acetylcholinesterase function. One push. 1 second of contact with the patient's bloodstream. Then atropine again, 5 milligrams, and she was pushing both medications into the IO line like she was writing a command in his blood chemistry: wake up. Fight back. Survive. The monitors told her everything. His heart rate was climbing back from the lethal bradycardia, 40, 42, 45, 48. His oxygen saturation holding at 94%. His pupils beginning to constrict toward normal as the atropine took hold. The seizure activity had stopped. His muscles were relaxing out of their tetanic grip. Smoke was thicker now, rolling across the ceiling in waves, collecting in the upper corners of the room like something alive. The fire alarm was still screaming. Emergency lights cast everything in a red and amber wash, and Sarah could hear the evacuation continuing in the corridor, the sound of wheelchairs moving, people calling orders, the bass rumble of the emergency generators kicking in. The oxygen delivery was still running from the wall unit, but it wouldn't last long if the fire spread. She had maybe 4 minutes before this room became untenable. She pulled off her badge and checked the monitor one more time, sinus rhythm. Steady. 102 beats per minute. Blood pressure climbing back into a survivable range. The praladoxime would need time to fully reactivate the nerve endings, but he was past the immediate kill point. He was stabilized. He was breathing on his own now, the ventilator settling into a supporting role rather than keeping him alive by sheer mechanical force. Sarah looked at the unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one hanging in her locker. The one she'd stitched there 17 years ago as a reminder of who she was when she needed to disappear. She reached into her pocket and pulled it out, the faded patch from 1st Marine Division, edges worn from handling, the emblem barely visible under the dirt and age. She placed it in General Hartley's palm and closed his fingers around it. "You're going to make it," she said, and her voice was different now, authoritative in a way that had nothing to do with institutional hierarchy and everything to do with someone who'd held lives together in worse places than this. "When you wake up, you're going to remember this. You're going to remember who saved you. And you're going to know that what Caldwell did, what he's been doing, it doesn't end here. Understood?" Hartley's fingers tightened around the patch. A reflex. A signal. A confirmation. The smoke was getting thicker. Sarah checked the corridor, empty now, everyone evacuated except for the firefighters and security personnel in the stairwells. She moved back to the general one more time, repositioning his head to keep his airway open, checking his IO line and force setup one more time, making sure everything that would keep him alive was running perfectly. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm. The ventilator whooshed. The room had become a pocket of survival in the middle of chaos. She closed the isolation room door behind her and walked into the smoke-filled corridor, her badge still hanging from her neck, her scrubs already starting to reek of burnt electrical wiring and the ozone smell that comes after a defibrillator discharge. She made it to the stairwell just as the firefighters were coming up, and she gave them the room number, gave them the information they needed, gave them the confidence that came from someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. No hesitation. No panic. Just Marine precision delivered in a Norfolk hospital. 3 hours later, Sarah would be escorted out by hospital security, her ID badge deactivated mid-shift, the termination paperwork already waiting in administration. But in that moment, walking down the stairwell with smoke clearing and her patient alive behind her, she let herself breathe. The inhale tasted like copper and burnt plastic. The exhale tasted like survival. "I'm going on break," she said to no one in particular as she pushed through the ground floor exit into the rain. The fire engines had the parking lot bathed in red and white light, and the rain was coming down hard, each drop hitting the hot asphalt like applause for a performance only she would remember. She sat down on a concrete barrier 30 meters from the hospital entrance and watched the firefighters work, knowing that what had happened in that room was only the beginning, knowing that Caldwell's strategy was about to accelerate into something far more dangerous than humiliation, knowing that the next 3 hours would be the moment everything changed. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she couldn't prove what she'd just done. She couldn't document it. She couldn't protect the evidence of Caldwell's sabotage because his hand was on every system. All she had was a seizing Marine general who would wake up with a faded patch in his hand and a medic's understanding in his bloodstream that someone had saved his life, and no medical chart that would ever show it happened. The rain fell harder. The isolation room filled with smoke like a living thing, creeping under the door and coiling around the ventilator tubing. Sarah's hands moved without hesitation. She didn't think about Caldwell or protocols or the fact that she was minutes away from losing everything. The general's body convulsed once, twice, the seizure activity still spiking despite the atropine, his oxygen saturation dropping like a stone in dark water. She'd seen worse. She'd lived worse. Pain is data, she told herself, the old combat medic's mantra rising up from muscle memory that years in the night shift couldn't erase. Seizures meant the organophosphate compound was still binding to his acetylcholine receptors, still drowning his nervous system from the inside. She pushed another dose of pralidoxime 4, watching his pupils constrict, watching the muscle rigidity ease by fractional degrees. His respirations were laboring now, 38 breaths per minute, too fast. Oxygen sat dropping from 88 to 85. Not enough oxygen. The smoke was stealing what little air remained. She grabbed the crash cart crash kit, fingers finding the intraosseous drill by touch alone, and drove the needle into his tibial plateau with the precision of someone who'd done this on combat wounded with artillery rounds still landing. The needle caught the marrow space with a faint pop. She was in. Blood flowed backward into the chamber, confirmation. She pushed 100 milliliters of normal saline to confirm patency, watching the fluid rush in without resistance, and her jaw tightened. Good. One access point. Enough. The fire was pulling oxygen from the room, from his lungs, from her own chest. She could taste copper and chemicals and something acrid that made her eyes water. Firefighters were moving closer, she could hear them in the corridor, boots on tile like the percussion of approaching salvation, but they were 3 minutes out, maybe 4. He didn't have 4 minutes. His chest wall moved wrong on the left side, barely moving at all. Pneumothorax. Developing. Building. The poison had weakened his respiratory muscles so severely that the trauma of violent seizures had torn pleural tissue, and his lung was collapsing like a deflating balloon. She reached into her locker, muscle memory from Ramadi, from 12 years of carrying field supplies most nurses would never touch, and her fingers found the MRE heating packet she'd sewn into her jacket lining along with the unit patch, the waterproof material designed to survive anything. She tore open a sterile chest seal package with her teeth, felt the adhesive backing peel away, and pressed the occlusive dressing directly over the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line where air was escaping. The seal held. His chest wall steadied. Oxygen sac climbed. 86. 88. 90. She held pressure for 15 seconds to ensure adhesion, felt his breathing deepen, felt the immediate impact of preventing a tension pneumothorax from fully developing. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum beneath the roar of the fire. Then she did something that belonged to the woman she'd been before the night shift, before the endless parade of dismissals and humiliations, before Dr. Caldwell had decided she was a problem to eliminate. Her right hand reached inside her jacket. The stitching was precise, she'd sewn it there 3 years ago, the day they confirmed the casualty status of her husband, Captain James Chen, killed when an IED took out his entire convoy outside Sanjin Valley. The faded unit patch from the 1st Marine Division was worn smooth at the edges from her fingers finding it at 0300 when sleep wouldn't come, worn soft from years of touching it in the darkness. She held it in her palm for 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3. Then she opened the general's hand, his right hand, the dominant hand, the hand that would remember what she was about to give him, and pressed the patch into his palm with the gentleness of someone laying flowers on a grave. His eyes flickered. Pupils reactive. Consciousness trying to return through the haze of sedation and organophosphate destruction. "Sir, you're going to make it," she whispered, her voice steady in a way that came from training that spanned 18 years and 3 continents. "If I don't, tell David his mother was here." His fingers closed around the patch with the reflex of a dying man grabbing for salvation. She held his hand for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and in that moment something inside her shifted. The compliance, the deferential bowing, the acceptance of public humiliation and private threats, all of it fell away like dead skin. 7 minutes later, firefighters found them both alive. General Hartley's stretcher glided through corridors that had become a geography of flame and smoke, Sarah's navigation precise despite the chaos, despite the heat, despite every alarm screaming the building was eating itself from the inside. She kept her hand on his full line, kept her eyes on his vital signs, kept counting his breaths like she'd counted the breaths of 17 Marines as a convoy burned around her in Ramadi. Out. Alive. Stable enough for transport to the burn center. Her scrubs were black with soot and striped with blood that might have been his or hers. When everything moved this fast, the distinction became theoretical. Security escorted her from the parking lot at 05:47 in the morning, 3 hours and 17 minutes after the fire alarm first screamed. Her ID badge was deactivated before she even reached the exit. The security guard, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22, looked genuinely sorry about it, his hand hovering near her elbow like he didn't quite know if escorting a nurse out counted as rough handling. Dr. Caldwell waited in the main lobby with 2 HR representatives flanking him like pallbearers, his expression arranged into concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. The morning shift was arriving for rounds, trickling in through the front entrance, and Sarah realized with crystalline clarity that this was theater. The humiliation had moved into its final act. "Sarah," he began, his voice pitched low and regretful for the witnesses filtering past, "your unauthorized access to a patient during an emergency evacuation, your violation of our safety protocols, and your documented ongoing performance issues leave us no choice." He held a manila folder the way a magician holds a card he's about to make disappear. "Effective immediately, your employment is terminated. Security will escort you to your locker to collect personal items, then off the premises." She didn't defend herself. There was nothing to defend. The protocol she'd violated was a lie designed to let him murder a retired Marine general, and the performance issues were her refusal to participate in institutional evil. She reached out and placed her ID badge on the folder, watched it settle there like a piece of evidence. "Thank you for the opportunity," she said quietly, and meant it, not for the job, but for the clarity. For learning that there were worse things than being fired. Caldwell's smile faltered at that, at her complete absence of fight, at her refusal to provide him the satisfaction of tears or anger. He had no idea who he was standing next to. Riverside Cemetery was grey and cold when she arrived at 0612, the headstone reading Captain James Chen, beloved husband, visible through the morning mist like something from another life. Sarah collapsed at the base of the stone the way a building collapses when its foundation has been removed, her body folding onto the wet grass, her composure finally fracturing like old pottery in her hands. Rain began. Hard rain. The kind that soaked through everything. "I found another one, James," she whispered, her voice breaking into pieces she didn't know how to put back together. "Another pattern like the others, and I wasn't fast enough. I failed him, James. I failed David. The general survived, but Caldwell is still walking free, still making decisions about who lives and who dies, and I'm sitting in a cemetery at dawn with no credentials and no credibility and no way to." She couldn't finish. The rain hammered down like punishment, like the universe's way of confirming what she'd always suspected, that the good she did in darkness would never matter because darkness doesn't issue press releases. She stayed there for 43 minutes, until her teeth chattered and her hands had gone numb and the grief had carved out new channels in her chest. She believed, in that moment, that she'd lost everything. The job. The credibility. The chance to stop Caldwell before he poisoned someone else. She believed that her son would inherit the shame of having a mother everyone knew had been fired, that the pattern she'd recognized would go unreported, that the general would wake up holding a patch he couldn't trace back to anyone, and the truth would die in the margins of a hospital where nothing mattered except institutional protection. She was wrong. The FBI's raid on Seattle General came 48 hours after the fire, and the agents moved through the corridors with the precision of people who had already assembled the entire conspiracy in their heads. Dr. Caldwell's office was cordoned off by 9 a.m., federal seals on the filing cabinets, his computer towers already being logged into evidence. Sarah received the call at 7:43 a.m., a voice identifying itself as Special Agent Patricia Mendez, asking her to come to the administrator's conference room at Seattle General. Not the county clinic. Not a follow-up termination meeting. The hospital itself. For the first time in 3 years, someone addressed her by her full name, Major Sarah Louise Chen. The fluorescent hum of the conference room felt different now, not oppressive, but witnessing. Sarah sat at the long mahogany table with her hands folded, still wearing the same scrubs from her evening shift, the faded unit patch no longer hidden in her jacket. She'd left it at home, pressed between 2 pages of a journal, the weight of it suddenly feeling like evidence. David walked in first. Just her son, no warning, no preparation for the way his marine dress blues would catch the light or how his voice would crack, just slightly, when he saw her sitting there alone. He moved from the doorway to her chair in 4 measured steps, the kind of movement that came from years of formations and protocol, and then he broke every bit of that training by pulling her into a hug that lasted longer than regulations probably allowed. When he stepped back, he was in full uniform, garrison cap tucked under his arm, his hair regulation short, his presence filling the room like he'd brought the weight of command with him. He said only one word, "Major," and snapped a salute so crisp it sounded like fabric splitting, and Sarah's chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the danger that had brought him here. He held the salute until she returned it, and then he sat beside her and didn't let go of her hand. The head nurse, Patricia Holloway, who had worked alongside Sarah for 6 years without knowing anything about her, entered carrying a classified file folder with a trembling hand. Patricia's voice shook as she opened the pages, the words slow and careful, Sarah's initial deployment orders, dated 15 years prior. Her unit designation, 1st Marine Division Medical Company. Her commendation records, each one blacked out and then UN blacked out by federal order, the redaction marks like scars that had finally healed. 2 deployments. 3. 4. The medical discharge paperwork signed by a 3-star general, marked "No shame, exemplary service, discharge due to combat-related injury requiring civilian medical care." Patricia looked up from the file with tears running down her face and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying anymore. The other nurses could see it now. The reason for the silence. The reason for the strength. The reason a woman who moved through their hospital like she was barely there had actually been standing post the entire time. A man in civilian clothes, Special Agent Marcus Webb, according to the nameplate someone placed on the table, stood and introduced himself as a Navy veteran, served aboard the USS Ronald Reagan, discharged with the rank of Electronics Technician 2nd Class. He opened a laptop and turned the screen toward Sarah. His voice carried the satisfaction of a sailor protecting one of their own. "I preserved every frame you tried to delete, Dr. Caldwell. Every single one." The security footage played on the screen in grayscale, timestamp running in the bottom corner. 2:13 a.m. Dr. Caldwell entering General Hartley's isolation room with a syringe. 2:49 a.m. Disconnecting before line. 2:51 a.m. Scattering medications across the bedside table. 2:54 a.m. The fire alarm blaring, and Caldwell fleeing down the corridor in the opposite direction. 2:56 a.m. Sarah arriving at the room, her movements like muscle memory made flesh, her hand steady as surgical lasers as she stabilized the general. The footage cut to black. Webb closed the laptop. "I recognized Major Chen's unit patch in the security footage when I reviewed it, same patch my brother wore in Ramadi before an IED took his legs. That's when I knew something was wrong with the narrative. When I knew to look deeper." The FBI field director, a woman named Margaret Chen, no relation, standing with the kind of authority that came from 23 years in federal service, outlined the conspiracy with the methodical precision of someone building a legal case brick by brick. Dr. Caldwell's offshore accounts, $2.3 million in pharmaceutical trafficking revenue. Encrypted communications with 3 separate pharmaceutical diversion networks operating out of Eastern Europe and the South China Sea. Falsified treatment records for 18 patients who showed organophosphate exposure, chemical weapons precursors that he'd been systematically selling to foreign actors. General Hartley wasn't a random admission. He was an active Marine intelligence officer investigating chemical weapons proliferation in Central Asia, and his investigation had gotten too close to Caldwell's network. The general had come to Seattle General for a routine consultation, and Caldwell had seen an opportunity to eliminate a witness. Sarah's email to a Department of Defense intelligence account, sent at 11:41 p.m. on the night of her termination, from her personal laptop, containing her medical observations and the flagged medication orders, had been the final piece of evidence that broke the case open. It sat in the prosecutorial record stamped with classification levels that had since been downgraded. Her observations. Her data. Her choice to report it, even when she had nothing left to lose. The jury deliberation lasted 90 minutes. Sarah attended every day of the 4-week trial, sitting in the gallery in the same dark blue blazer, her jaw set with a quiet dignity that had been misread as meekness for her entire career at the hospital. Caldwell's legal team attempted desperate defenses, arguments about medical judgment calls, claims about treatment variance, suggestions that the medications were within acceptable ranges given the patient's symptoms. None of it held. The evidence was too clean, too documented, too thoroughly preserved by a Navy veteran who had recognized the unit patch of a brother-in-arms and decided that loyalty meant something. The prosecution called the 16 other patients whose treatment records Caldwell had falsified, each one a potential witness whose medical condition could have been exploited or worsened. The jury found guilty on all counts. 23 counts of pharmaceutical trafficking, 9 counts of insurance fraud, 3 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. The judge's sentencing came down like the closing of a door: 23 years federal penitentiary, immediate medical license revocation, lifetime prohibition from practicing medicine in any state, and restitution totaling $4.7 million to be divided among his victims. General Hartley testified during victim impact statements, recovered now, his voice steady and commanding, his presence in the courtroom like he'd brought the entire Marines with him. He looked directly at Caldwell and said, "You saw a quiet night shift nurse and assumed she was weak. You read weakness in silence and dignity in humiliation. You missed the warrior standing post while you slept." The courtroom went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hammering against the windows like it was trying to break through. Caldwell's face finally showed something other than calculated composure, panic, rage, the kind of desperation that comes when the strategic moves fail and the escape routes close. He stood during his own statement and attempted to blame Sarah, to claim her instability and insubordination had forced him into defensive actions, but his words landed in a courtroom that had already seen the security footage, that had already counted the victims, that had already recognized the pattern of a man who had mistaken silence for compliance. Sarah saw him once, in the months after sentencing, during her evening runs past Seattle General. He was working the night security desk now, the former chief of medicine wearing a black uniform with a cheap polyester nameplate that read Security Guard, 2200 to 0600 shift. The system had stripped everything from him, his credentials, his income, his status, his future, and given him the exact night shift he had once used to destroy others. She passed by the glass entrance, her running pace steady, her breathing controlled, and his eyes dropped before she could even register his face. She didn't speak, didn't need to. The salute never came from her. Just a single nod, the kind that said everything without saying anything, and then she was past him, her footsteps echoing in the parking lot like the footsteps of someone who had learned that the quietest people often carried the most weight. 6 months after the trial, Sarah returned to Seattle General, but not as a night shift nurse working invisibly in the margins. The hospital board, desperate to rebuild trust and restore the reputation that Caldwell's conviction had shattered across 3 news cycles, offered her the position of Director of Emergency Medical Services. Full authority. Full title. Full visibility. She accepted it with the same quiet efficiency with which she'd done everything else, the same composure that had been misread as weakness for her entire career. The faded unit patch hung in a frame on her office wall now, next to a photograph of James, his smile captured in some moment of peace before the deployment that took him, before the silence that came after. And on the wall of Marine General Raymond Hartley's office at Camp Lejeune, the same patch was mounted in a shadow box with a placard, Major Sarah Chen, 1st Marine Division Medical Company. The quietest warrior in the room is often the most dangerous. David visited monthly, always in uniform, and brought other young Marines with him, corpsmen, mostly, the ones who wanted to meet the major who had proven that healing hands could be as powerful as any weapon, that medical knowledge and field trauma protocols were a form of combat, that you didn't need a rifle to save lives in the dark. The hospital's veteran nurses established a mentorship program in Sarah's name, teaching situational awareness and crisis medicine to new graduates, teaching them that silence could be a strategy and that dignity was its own form of resistance. On the anniversary of the fire, Sarah stood at James's grave again, but this time the sun was breaking through the clouds, and she touched the engraved name and whispered, "I found the pattern. I stopped him. I didn't lose myself in the silence." She drove back to Seattle General for night rounds, not hiding anymore, but choosing when to be seen, and there was a difference between those things. The other nurses straightened when she passed through the corridors now, respect clear in their eyes, because they finally understood what had always been true, that the woman moving like a ghost through their hallways had actually been standing post the entire time, protecting patients and colleagues from a threat she'd recognized alone, in the dark, with nothing but her training and her choice to speak up when silence would have been easier. Heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrub, saving lives in the dark. If you found Sarah's story powerful, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and leave a comment with your answer to this question. If you recognized a threat no one else could see, would you risk everything to report it?